So live stream is going. In Construct, I've got Construct open. We're going to start following along. As we work, remember, this is just meant to be the basics. You can take this game shell and kind of do whatever you want to do with it as we start to go along. So I'm going to start with a new game, and I'm going to do an empty SD landscape 16:9 project. And it's going to start off here. I'm going to control scroll to zoom out, and I can kind of move things around with my pushing down on the mouse wheel. I've got this gray bar to show me where my window ends and where my layout ends. So what I want to do here is I want to take my window size, which is right here. I want to copy it, the 854 by 480, and I want to paste that into my layout size and just hit enter. So you're going to see that the window is going to shrink down in size. And now I've got a layout size that matches the actual window size. And so everything that's on the window is something that we'll see on the screen. So we've started that. We kind of going to keep going. And we're going to add a background sprite. So what we'll do here is we'll add in, double click to insert a new object. That object is going to be a sprite on layer 0 for right now. We will resize it to be the 854 pixels wide by the 480 pixels high. And I'm going to pick just an orange color to start. And I'm going to start making new frames. And I'm just going to start picking new colors. So in this animation frame window, I'm just clicking on Add New Frame. I've got an orange, a yellow, a green. Colors don't really matter right now. This is all just to kind of keep some of the basic issues we learned there. So for frames, I've got an orange, a yellow, a green, a blue, and a reddish pinkish. Doesn't matter where they are. The one thing I do want to happen is when we close this out, I want to center it on here. So if I do the actual math and say, all right, I'm going to put this at 427 in the X direction and 240 in the Y direction, that's going to be in the exact midpoint of the screen. Now I don't want to accidentally move that. So I'm going to go to the layers. I'm going to lock this layer and rename it background. And then I've got my sprite named Sprite. What's a good name for this sprite?
Background.
Background. All right, so we'll go rename this sprite to background. And I'm just going to take a look and see what my layout looks like. So I'll hit run layout. And right here, you can see, what did we forget to do? We didn't stop the background animation. So there's two ways we can stop the background animation. We can double click on the object in the background, and we can set the frame speed to 0. From this default animation, now it's not going to animate. It'll always be on frame 0 because that's where it is by default. So on here, we've got the background layer. I want to put in some, let's see, where did we do? I want to put in some logic now. I'm going to do things, no, I'm going to keep going in order. So we renamed it. Now I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to rename this one to be player layer. And with player layer, that's where I'm going to start building things. We're going to build a player, an enemy, and a projectile. So those are the 3 sprites that we're going to build right now. So just double click, add sprite on the player layer, resize it. We'll make the player 40 by 40 pixels. And I'm going to go right now with the off-white color, which is, I think, 250, 250, 250. Alpha is going to stay at 255. That means it's not opaque. And I've now just made a sprite. I'm going to rename this one to be player. And that's what we'll control around. The next sprite we're going to build is going to be enemy. So I'm going to go with the 50, 50, 50 off black color. Oh, I didn't resize that, so I'll go back to Sprite, hit resize, and set that to 50 by 50. So I forgot to do the size for that one. I want it to be 50 by 50. So the enemy is a little bit bigger than the player, but that's kind of the way I want it for right now. Still can't have the name just Sprite, so we'll go enemy. Keep things ordered. And then I think the next thing that we're going to make is the projectile. And the projectile is going to be 10 by 10. So it's going to be smaller than the player and the enemy. And I'm going to go back to that off-white color, 250, 250, 250. All right, so now this sprite here, that's the smaller one, I'm going to rename to projectile. And we have the projectile as a sprite. The only thing that I want to add to the projectile is I want to add a couple of behaviors. I want to add the bullet behavior. That's why I didn't call it bullets, because there's a behavior called bullet. And so when you're typing through and coding things, you don't want to accidentally grab the wrong part. So I called it projectile because it's what we're going to launch. If the player is constantly launching projectiles in all directions and we don't delete them, eventually you're going to have like a million objects on the screen. Your game is going to be going very slow because of that. So we're going to add one more behavior here, which is a new one. I don't think we've done it yet. Destroy outside of layout. So what destroy outside of layout do is it'll automatically destroy the object if it leaves the layout area. So we can destroy the bullet as soon as it moves off the screen. If we run our layout now, the only thing that we're going to see is the bullet by default moves off this way and then it gets destroyed. So no code as of yet. We've got a background layer that's locked, a player layer, an enemy, a player, and a projectile. And the projectile has behaviors. And then while we're at it, I'm going to go to the player, and I'm going to add a behavior that is bound to layout. So it's going to keep the player inside the layout as we go through. Sammy, you good? What's up?
What's the size of the projectile?
I made it 10 by 10. Yeah, if you get stuck, throw your hands up, because I'm like looking across and just shout out questions. We'll answer them. What do you got?
Destroy outside of layout.
Destroy outside of layout, yeah. So that's the behavior that I added to the projectile, is destroy outside of layout. And then, I mean, you could make a really mean game where you destroy the player outside of the layout. Like if they move to the edge of the screen, they'll get destroyed, they'll lose a life. That would be actually pretty mean. But we'll just say bound to layout so you can't leave the layout. Okay, so let's switch over to the event sheet. Questions so far? Looking good? All right, on the event sheet, what we're going to do is add an event. And actually, I don't want to add an event yet. I want to right-click and add a global variable first. So by adding a global variable, we'll call it BG color for background color. And we'll just let it sit at 0 for right now. But what we can do is add a new event, and it's going to be system on start of layout. So on the start of layout, the action we want to add. Anybody have their background still advancing in through the frames? Here's a coverall to get rid of that. Through the event sheet, you can add an action to background called animation stop. So right now over here, I can just say my first instruction when the layout starts is background stop animation. So if you didn't remember to set your frame down to 0, you've stopped the animation this way. The other action we're going to add is going to be to the system. The system, we want to set value of BG color, because it's our little variable. That's where we're going to store it. And this is where we start to get some of our JavaScript code in here. We're going to set it to the value of floor. And as soon as I type floor, it says rounds down to nearest integer. Round down to integer. So now inside the floor, we're going to say random 0, comma 5. So the random command, if we look at random at the start, random, it says range random numbers to generate from 0 to 1 less than this value. If I do 0, comma 5, that means that it's going to be generating a random number between 0 and 4.9999999. But the floor is going to make sure it always rounds down. So 4.99 will become 4. 3.5 will become 3. 2.25 will become 2. 1.15 will become 1. And 0.5 will become 0. So we've made it so the system on the starter layout will randomly pick a number 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay? And that matches the number of animations that we made. So the action we're going to add here is going to be to the background, and it's going to be a set frame. And we're going to set frame to BG color. So what you'll notice now is when I run the layout and we refresh, it should be picking a new random color. And I'm getting a lot of greens, and there we go. Now I'm starting to get all the colors. I haven't seen there's my orange. So we're starting to get all these colors here through. So now the background should be different every time you play the game. Does that mean that you have to stick with these background colors? No. Eventually you could give it your own theme. Like if you want to change it into a tank game, you would have different terrains the tank would be moving on. Maybe there's like a snow environment, a desert environment, a forest environment. If you want to change it to a spaceship game, you could have it with a different cosmos background that's kind of like swirling and animating, or a planetary system background, or somewhere else. So that's just kind of one of our basic things here. On the event sheet, we're going to handle now the player kind of moving around. And I'm going to make some changes from the code that we actually had. And what we're going to do here is we're going to add a couple of commands. We're going to add the touch, and we're going to add the mouse. So those are our input objects that we're using. The instructions say add in the event to rotate is in touch, but that means you constantly have to be clicking to get the character to move around to the screen. We can try and do that for this game in case you make it a mobile version, but I might change it afterwards. Sammy, what's up?
What's the last action that you do for it?
I added in the touch and the mouse. That was it. So my last action, you're talking about this one here?
Yeah.
Set animation frame to BG color. So background, set frame, and then instead of typing in a number there, you're going to type in the variable BG color. So now we want to figure out what's actually happening. I'm going to change up the instructions a little bit. We're going to go to System, and we're going to grab every tick. So every tick, we're going to add an action to the player that rotates. It's spelled rotate. Rotate towards position. And the position that I'm going to use is going to be 200 degrees. That's our speed. Mouse.x and mouse.y. So basically, the program's going to look and say, where is the mouse facing? So wherever the mouse is facing, that will be where we want to rotate our character towards. So on our layout now, here when we look, you can see my character is kind of following along the mouse or rotating with the mouse pretty quickly. And I can move around, and it'll look better when it's an actual tank or a spaceship or something. But now our character follows the mouse. Okay? The other thing that we added in here on the player, we added the behavior. And that behavior is going to be the 8-direction movement. But we're going to do a very specific change with the 8-direction movement. So now we can use the arrow keys to move the character around on the screen. But in that 8-direction movement, where it says set angle, I'm going to change it to no. Because if it's set as set angle, watch what happens. When I start to move my character around on the screen, the character rotates around, but is just constantly looking. Actually, I don't know if we need to do that yet, because I think we fixed it with the mouse. We might not need to change it. So the character is always kind of strafing towards where the mouse is pointing. And you can use the arrow keys to move the character around now. But now we want some other things to happen. So we'll leave that there. I don't know if we need to change this to no, because I think it'll still move towards the mouse on no. Yeah, so it's still following where the mouse is pointing. So it's kind of like our targeting reticle. We could even make like a targeting reticle, like an overlay of a cursor that just follows the mouse, so you can always see what you're aiming at. But now we want to have some commands on here. We already did the background color. On start of layout is our first one. We're going to make a new variable now called player fire rate. The reason why we're making it a variable is think in the future for power-ups. Okay? If you want a power-up that makes the character fire super fast, maybe you could lower that number down, make the fire rate or the fire delay lower. Okay? So I'm going to set that to 0.3. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do system every X seconds. And instead of putting in a number here for the interval, I'm going to type in the variable player fire rate. And so now, every 0.3 seconds, the game is ready to do something for us. And what it's going to do is we're going to add an action onto the player. And the player is going to spawn another object. And that object is going to be the projectile. Layer can stay at 0. Actually, no, layer I don't want it to be at 0. I want it to be on the player layer, because the background layer is layer 0. So we'll change it to player layer. Image point 0 just means it's spawning at the center of the object. When you update your sprite with like a tank or a spaceship that's got like a cannon on the end, and you want it to launch from the end of the cannon, you would add a new image sprite in there. Okay? So basically we've got this piece here that's going to spawn a projectile on this layer. So now if we go and look and run the layout, and I bring it over to here, you can kind of see I'm going to constantly be firing towards this. We may change this to on mouse click fire at player rate, or when we're holding the mouse click. But for right now, I'll just leave it for this. What's up?
So what was the thing that you put for player?
Player, and it's spawn another object. And the object that it's spawning is the projectile. And it's spawning it on the layer of the player layer inside quotes. If you don't put it inside quotes, it'll spawn on the background layer, which is locked, and it may cause overlapping issues later on in the game. So we kind of want everything to spawn in the player layer. We're going to make a heads-up layer, a HUD, things like that. Okay? So, what else do we got for instructions now? Sorry, didn't mean to bring that up. Now we want to look at the enemy. Right now it's not really doing anything, but we want to get it to move towards the player. So we're going to add another global variable. This one's going to be called enemy move speed. And again, I'm keeping camel case in there. And I'm going to use this at 1, and it's going to basically move the enemy 1 pixel per second towards the player. Okay? So now, inside that system, every tick, we're going to add 2 new actions. The action is going to be on the enemy, and we're going to say rotate towards position. The position is going to be player.x and player.y. So it knows where the player is. We're going to change it to be 200 degrees instead of 0 degrees, so it can move as fast as the player. And so now the enemy should rotate to follow the player. And we can add one more action to the enemy on that same every tick. And that's going to be, what is it called? It's called move forward. And we're going to move forward. Distance, they have it as 1. I'm going to change it to enemy move speed, because maybe there's a debuff that you'll pick up that will make the enemies move faster. And you may want to adjust how fast they're moving for a certain time without having to go back into the code and adjust it there. So now, if I run this layout again, sorry, I got to bring my window over. What we can see now is the enemy follows the player pretty consistently, but it's not as fast as the player. I'm moving a little bit faster. And we may change that, or we may give it a number of lives. We can always adjust and tweak the values in the game right now. So we kind of have the basics of what's going to happen here, and now the enemy is just kind of there. All right. We want to add some logic for where the enemy's going. Questions so far? Everybody good? Zach.
Is the player supposed to move?
The player moves with the arrow keys. So one of the changes that I made is I added, it's not in the instructions yet because we're just added it as we were playing. One of the behaviors I added was 8 direction.
Okay.
So that the player can move around with the arrow keys, and we may bind that to WASD because, I don't know, it feels weird stretching to do the arrow keys in the mouse. You use like arrow keys and space bar, but anyways. Now we've got to figure out what's going to happen to the enemy when it's hit by a projectile. Now, for right now, we can do it as like 1 projectile, but maybe there'll be tougher enemies that take like 5 hits before it will go away. Things like that, but we'll get into instance variables there. So on the event sheet, I want to add a new global variable called score. It's kind of self-explanatory. It's keeping track of our score. Score is going to start off at 0. I need to make a new event here, and it's going to be for the projectile. I will say is overlapping another object, and that object is going to be the enemy. So when the projectile is overlapping the enemy, there's going to be 3 actions that we take. Destroy the enemy, destroy the projectile, and add 1 to the score. Even though we're not displaying it yet, we know we want to have score. So this would be enemy destroy, projectile destroy, and system add 2 score by 1. So now if I run the layout again, and I refresh this, so the enemy is chasing me, but as soon as I shoot one of those bullets at the enemy's gone. All right, so it's looking pretty good. But now one enemy on the screen isn't very cool yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a couple of spawn locations around the outside on the layout. So that enemies will spawn from all around. And then we're going to make it so that they wiggle either horizontally or vertically as they're making their way towards the player, so they're not just constantly making a beeline towards the player. So to do this, back on the layout, we're going to make a new sprite. The size I'm going to set as 150 by 150. The color, I'm just going to make be like a bright color. It'll be invisible later. It'll also be off the screen. But it's just going to be there as that size. And then instead of being called Sprite, I'm going to rename this to spawn location 0. And we're going to do some pretty cool things with that spawn location 0. The reason why we're adding 0 on the end is because we're going to have other spawn locations like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And as they're placed around, we can determine like randomly which spawn location the enemies are going to spawn from. So they're not all spawning from the same one every time. It'll pick one at random and spawn at a different time. So spawn location 0 is the name, and I'm just going to kind of place it up here in a diagonal away. Now, I want copies. I want 1, 2, 3 across the top, another one on the corner, one on the sides, corner, 3 across the bottom. Or maybe this will be the third one up here. So maybe we'll just spawn and do 7. So if I go here, I can make that again. But if I hit clone object type and I just kind of place it right here, notice how it enumerates for us. So this is spawn location 1, clone object type. This one is spawn location 2. And if I just keep on cloning, it's just going to keep on enumerating and adding that next object. So here's one for this corner. Here's one for the middle of the bottom. Here's one for this corner. And here's one for the middle of the side. So that gives us 8 locations. They don't have to be perfect. I'm just going to try and line them up about where I think they need to be. And again, all these can be tweaked out later. And then one thing that's been bugging me, the projectile is still on the screen. I'm going to move its position to like -100, 100. And so it's just off the screen. So that way we won't see it at the start. So now we've got these spawn locations where the sprites will actually spawn from. So we made, what, 7 or 8 of these? There are 8 locations around where we can spawn from. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Questions so far? All right, I don't see anything. So now we want to have the enemies spawn, but I don't want to spawn every set number of seconds. I want to spawn every range of seconds. So what we're going to do is we're going to add 2 new variables. This is going to be spawn time minimum, or spawn time min, which will say the quickest that they can spawn is going to be every 0.75 seconds. And then we'll do another variable, spawn time max. And the longest it will take for the new enemy to spawn will be 3 seconds. So now we've got a range in which they'll spawn. And we may need another new variable to figure out randomly where it's going to spawn from, but we may do a couple of those. So we want to add a couple of things here. So that's going to cover the spawns. And then what we'll do is we'll add on the every X seconds event. We're going to make a new one. So there's one every X seconds that's for player fire rate. We're going to do system every X seconds. This one is going to be random. And the ranges that we're going to use are going to be spawn time minimum, comma, spawn time maximum. So now this every X seconds is going to randomly be between 0.75 seconds and 3 seconds. And what we'll do is we'll add an action to spawn location 0. And what we'll do is we'll do spawn another object on the player layer. And we're going to spawn an enemy. Okay. So now spawn location 0 is spawning an enemy on the player layer randomly. So it's only going to be coming from spawn location 0, which is my upper left. But what we can do is we could copy this action and change each one of these to be for the next spawn location one. I think we can right click and do replace object. That's a quick way of doing it. And we want to replace this one first, second, third. Actually, we did 0. Yeah, 0 is the one we have. We want to do it as number 2. So now I should have 0, 1, 2. So over here, the quickest way to do this is right click, replace object. But because I have 2 objects in that line, I have to pick spawn location 0. This one's going to be the third one. Right click, replace object. Spawn location is what we're replacing. This one's going to be the fourth one. Right click. Did I get everything? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so replace an object, spawn location. This one is going to be 5. Replace object, spawn location. This one's going to be 6. Replace object, spawn location. This one's going to be 7. So now, when we run this, hopefully I won't get overwhelmed by the number of new things that are going to be on the screen in a second. But here you can kind of see everything's kind of closing in very quickly on the player. Yeah, so that's a lot to have every couple seconds with our fire rate set there. They're just constantly following the player around. They're constantly rotating towards where our player is. But it's a lot to do, right? And we're getting overwhelmed very quickly. All right. So how can we divide this up so it's not so overwhelming? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this line of code. So there are 2 of them. And on this upper one, I'm going to delete every other action. So this is going to cover 0, 2, 4, and 6. The other one's going to cover 1, 3, 5, and 7. So that way they won't all be spawning exactly at the same time. They're going to be spawning half as often. So there's the odd ones. This one's going to be the even ones. All right, so now we should get a little bit more variety in the spawn objects. So there's a little bit more variety. And we can do some more with the movement and make things move around a little bit differently in a second.
Did you see it?
Let's see, where do we go here? So we did that. We kind of moved things around. I'm going to have to make a note to myself. Split odds and evens for... Split odds and evens for a variety. So different locations will spawn at different time. Let's deal with that score. Did we add a score variable yet? Yeah, score is 0. We need to go back out onto the layout, and we need to add some text. So on the layout, we're going to add text. This is going to be on the player layer for right now. We may move it to the heads up layer later. And we want to make sure it's large enough to handle the score going up. For the text properties, the initial thing is going to start with score : 0. Then I'm going to set the font size to at least 48, just to make sure it's big enough for us to see it on the screen. Color, I'm going to change to the color picker, and let's see if we can put in a custom color for 250, 250, 250. So there's our score, matching the size. It's our off-white color. For hotspot, I'm going to assign it to horizontal center, vertical center, hotspot center. And now, no matter how big this gets, this score is going to stay here, here. So I'll put it like right on the bottom of the screen, give it some space to grow. And then maybe we'll set it to be X position, like right in the middle of the X. Maybe we'll say, what is that, 427? So it'll be right in the middle of the screen. What else can we do to make this look cool? Let's change its opacity to like 75% or 80%. So it's there. We have our score, and every time we hit one of the spawn objects, it should be adding up to the score. Other things we can do with this score is we can right-click on it. We can say Z order, send to the bottom of the layer. That way enemies will be able to walk over the score rather than being underneath the score. But it's up to you what you like, whether you want it on top or bottom. what we need to do now is back on the event sheet, we need to go find that every tick and add action to every tick. For the system, we want it to set the value of, let's see. Well, last year, what's up, Mr. Fortuna?
Nothing. I was going to explain something to you, but I'll explain to you later.
Okay. I'll stop the stream in like 5 minutes. Okay? Okay. Add action. Oh, I don't want to add action to the, sorry, I picked the wrong thing. It should be system. I want to add action to the text. So we're on every tick, add action, and it's going to be set text, and I want to set it to score colon with a space, and now I'm going to, outside the quotation marks, ampersand score. So that means it's always going to use that default header of the word score with a colon and a space. Then it'll add the variable score. So if we run layout now, my score is 1, and I'm about to get overwhelmed because we still haven't balanced things out. And we still haven't tweaked how the players are going to move yet.
Can you go back to the event sheet?
I'll go back to the, yeah, absolutely. Back on the event sheet, here it is. Which one do you want to see? This part? It was on every tick, add to the score. All right, so we added the score. I want to add a behavior to the enemy. Let's see. I want to add a sign behavior to the enemy before we finish. So behaviors, add behavior, sign. And so that way it's going to oscillate back and forth. I'm going to leave the values at default to start. Because we can do horizontal or vertical. And we'll just see what does that look like when the players start to move in on. Ooh, so this adds a little bit more variety because now they're not just always moving towards the player. Sometimes they're moving a little bit away from the player. Sometimes they're moving towards the player. I think that spawn time is still too high, though. I'm going to go adjust that and say minimum spawn time is going to be 1.25. So that way there'll be fewer things spawning. I could also disable some of the spawn locations. But as we go through and spawn things, we can do a couple other things. I'm going to go to enemy on created, add action to the enemy, and I should be able to find the sign. Now, is it wave? Oh, we can do square, solid. Oof. I want to be able to set it to a random thing. We're going to have to make a list, though. It's going to be for the enemy. What else can we do for the sign? Active, inactive, magnitude. We can change period. We can change initial state. That doesn't help us. Set movement. Ooh, okay. So we have horizontal and vertical. I got to think about the logic for this one here. We're going to stop the stream here, and I'm going to give you time to